We're really delighted to have Christopher Dickey with us this evening. His new book, Our Man in Charleston, Britain's Secret Agent in the Civil War South, focuses on someone named Robert Bunch, who, even if you are a student of the Civil War, you probably don't know. And yet Chris makes quite a compelling case that this obscure British consul played a pivotal role during his years in South Carolina. Chris, of course, is especially well-suited to research and write this historical tale of international diplomacy, political intrigue, and espionage. As a longtime journalist, he's been immersed in the world of foreign affairs for decades, first heading bureaus for the Washington Post in Central America and the Middle East, then serving as Paris bureau chief for Newsweek, and most recently working as the Paris-based foreign editor for the Daily Beast. Of course, for all his globe-trotting, a part of Chris is rooted in the American South, where he spent some of his childhood. In fact, without too much nudging, you probably could get him to slip into a bit of a Southern accent. Where in the South? Well, you can. We'll get to that. That's part of this evening's entertainment. He's also an experienced author. His first two books grew directly out of his early reporting experiences, including With the Contras in 1986 and Expats in 1990. He's written a couple of novels about jihadist terrorism and a memoir about his father, Summer of Deliverance. And his last book, Securing the City, was about the NYPD's anti-terror force and made the New York Times list of notable books of 2009. This new book has been germinating for much of the past 25 years while Chris worked on these other projects and held down his day job. He'll no doubt fill you in on some of the particulars about how the book developed, but suffice it to say that the wait was well worth it, at least for us as readers. A review in the Boston Globe said Chris, quote, tells Bunch's story with aplomb and a good deal of fine wit. And the Wall Street Journal commended this fascinating book as, quote, thoroughly researched and deftly crafted, adding that it will, quote, introduce people to a man who should be better known, one who cannily fought the good fight at a fateful moment in history. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Christopher Dickey.
Thanks, Brad. Hello, is this doing?
Yeah, that works.
It's working? Okay, good. It's great to be here at Politics and Prose, which is really one of the great independent bookstores of the United States. And I love independent bookstores. I think we should all applaud them. I was here once talking years ago, and I never forgot it. And I've been looking forward to coming back ever since. It's also great to be here and see so many old friends from the Washington Post. I feel that, the Post has really turned out for me tonight, and I appreciate that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book and about how I came to write it, and then move as quickly as possible to questions and answers, or at least questions and attempts at answers, about the book and about the South and the Confederacy and maybe the Confederate flag and all kinds of things like that, if you're not tired of talking about that already. See that Southern accent? I can hear it creeping back in again.
What do you want to say? Where in the South?
Oh, yeah, where in the South? We'll start the questions and answers before the talk. Actually, I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and my father's family is from Georgia, from North Georgia and from Atlanta, and my mother's family is from West Tennessee, around Union City, Tennessee. And then I went to elementary school in Atlanta, and then we moved to Oregon when I was about 11 years old. And I did my best to lose my Southern accent as quickly as I possibly could, because everybody made fun of me because I had a Southern accent. It's the kind of thing, you're in lunch line and they come up to you and they say something for us, and you say, what do you want me to say? And they all crack up. Well, you lose it. But it comes back. It does come back. And, you know, if I go into a filling station in South Carolina and immediately from filler up on, I'm speaking with a Southern accent. Also, I think it's safer sometimes to do that. Otherwise you get that, you ain't from around here, are you? So, 25 years ago, I was reading a biography of a famous British explorer and spy, Sir Richard Francis Burton, who visited the United States in 1860 and disappeared for several weeks, somewhere between Washington, D.C. and New Orleans. I don't know what he was doing, and I don't think anybody does. But I had a hunch that there might be a compelling story to be told about British spies in the American South on the eve of the American Civil War. That if you sort of played with those elements, fiction or nonfiction, maybe you could sort of have John le Carré meet the Confederacy. And it seemed like a good idea. So this was a project I picked up and put down and picked up and put down. The one day that I said I'm just going to do nothing but work on this book was early in September 2001. I closed the doors, I turned off the TV, and thank God the super of the building came in and knocked on the door and he says, "Have you seen these planes that just hit the World Trade Center?" So that was the beginning of a period when I was not working on the book. You know, narratives change as they develop, books evolve, and so does the history we're living. Finally, it took me about 15 years before I came across the private and confidential correspondence of British consul Robert Bunch, who was Queen Victoria's man in Charleston, South Carolina, from 1853 to 1863. He had been a footnote in countless books about the Civil War. Nobody had ever looked closely, however, at who he was and what he was doing. In fact, all interpretations of what he was doing were almost completely wrong. Indeed, to this day, and I just checked, there is not even a Wikipedia entry for Robert Bunch. Everybody goes, wow. Imagine anybody gets a Wikipedia. But well, actually, there is one. It's in German. German Wikipedia. Why did they do it? Because the Germans are very methodical, and they went through the Foreign Service list, and they got him in there somehow. But there's no English language entry for Robert Bunch so far. Eventually, I was able to find a lot of his private correspondence. And as I read through his dispatches and letters that were scattered in archives all over England, I realized he was a critical player in what Amanda Foreman has called that gray area where diplomacy and espionage meet, and that without him and his reporting, Great Britain might well have backed the secession of the slave-owning, cotton-growing South. This minor diplomat, an incredibly duplicitous spy who was thought of by the slave owners as a great friend and ally, had helped mightily to defeat the Confederacy and to determine the fate of these United States. So I knew I had my man, and the book taking shape was no longer, in any respect, going to be a work of fiction. This was a history that might change the way we think about the Civil War. And growing up in the South, I thought a lot about the Civil War. But in the meantime, a great deal of new history was being made. Terror had come to American soil. The United States set out to occupy foreign lands. A far-right movement claiming the name of the Tea Party developed a powerful following, even as a black man who loves to echo Lincoln was elected to be president of the United States. And then just a month before this book was to be published, news broke of the horrific massacre at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. And once again, a furious debate began about the Confederate battle flag and the Civil War and what it is that we should or should not remember about all that. The coincidence was appalling, but it wasn't completely surprising. One of the things I had learned over a quarter century researching one little corner of American history while covering, as a foreign correspondent, a succession of American military actions abroad, most of which have been forgotten, is that the one war that never ends for many people in the United States is the war between the states. And one of the most important lessons I learned about that war is how badly we have failed to understand its most obvious lessons. It needs to be remembered that the history of wars is largely a history of delusions. those dreams of rapid victories based on simple strategies that lead to long nightmares of slaughter. The French write about what they call la logique de guerre, by which they mean a pathology that takes over politics and the press and eventually a whole people, discouraging all debate and dissension. Costs are not calculated, benefits are fabricated. The rhetoric of glory disguises the grotesque realities of combat until armed confrontation not only seems inevitable, it is inevitable. I'll leave it to you to ponder the extent to which that is a problem with us today. But certainly the first lesson we should learn from the war between the states should be that it was based on delusions, which our man in Charleston, British consul Robert Bunch, understood and reported on with uncanny accuracy. The reasons that the fighting began in 1861 and the reasons that it turned out as it did seemed simple to me when I was young, then enormously complicated when I studied the conflict more closely. States' rights, yes, and free trade, the insults of the abolitionists, the South's loss of its dominance over the federal government, and the rapacious cotton economy's addiction to slavery all drove the Southerners toward secession. Amid that turmoil, the extremists played off each other so effectively that the voices of moderation, indeed the voices of the majority on each side, were lost, and to an amazing extent have remained obscure to many Americans ever since. And yet, as Consul Bunch saw perfectly clearly, because it was stated perfectly clearly by the powerful people he knew both privately and publicly, and indeed was stated in the ordinances of secession for almost every one of the Confederate states, ultimately there was no question that the South seceded to defend slavery, and the North went to war to stop secession. This is a simple concept. You can reduce it to 140 characters. Next time you see anybody or hear anybody say the war was not about slavery, you can tweet that out. The South seceded to defend slavery and the North went to war to stop secession. That's what the Civil War was about. There should be no debate about that today, and yet there is, because people cling to delusions with greater faith and conviction than they devote to facts. So let's not debate why it was the South seceded, why it was the North went to war. But here's an aspect of history that is not denied so much as it is ignored. Let's understand that when secession finally seemed inevitable, the strategic notion that made it actually seem possible was based on a single, stunningly simple and stunningly wrong calculation. The secessionists assumed that Britain, the most powerful nation on earth, had no choice but to support the cotton-growing Confederacy with official recognition and support. If it came to a fight, the secessionists believed, the British would supply the money, the arms, and the naval power to guarantee the South's separation from the Union. They would sweep away what was at first a paper blockade. They would bottle up what was, in fact, a tiny federal army at the beginning of the war, and that would be checkmate, game over. Why? Why would the British do that? Why would the secessionists believe that? Because raw cotton was the most important international commodity of the 19th century. You could say it was to the 19th century what oil was to the 20th and to the 21st. Without it, the textile mills of Britain and France would shut down and hundreds of thousands of people would lose their jobs overnight. And Britain got 80% of its raw cotton from the slave-owning South. So the secessionists figured that Britain really would have no choice but to back them. The Confederate tail would wag the British bulldog. I think I won't say that again. What they did not count on was that the British might hold their noses and accept the fact that slaves grew cotton for British mills. But London could say that was an internal problem for the United States. But there were limits. Where the British drew the line on this whole question of slave-grown cotton was on the question of the slave trade with Africa, which the public and politicians in Britain, and indeed in the United States, had recognized for more than 50 years as essentially a Holocaust, and which successive British governments fought against relentlessly, deploying naval squadrons off the coasts of Africa, Cuba, and South America, and eventually spending an estimated 2% of the GDP of Great Britain in the struggle to shut down the Middle Passage. What Consul Bunch did in his secret dispatches was to take the rhetoric of the Southern extremists and turn it against them. The fire eaters, as they were called, argued that slavery was not a necessary evil in their world, which was the popular view, but a positive good for the inferior black race, which God, in fact, had created to be enslaved. And this being the case, they said, the slave trade with Africa must be reopened. In fact, how could you say it was a bad thing? Because that would be denying that slavery was a good thing. Well, Bunch used that extensively. He reported on it in enormous detail. It also escaped nobody's notice that the South was running low on slave labor, and the price of slaves had risen astronomically. One of the things people, I think, really don't understand is that there was a bubble market in humans just before the Civil War. To keep expanding its cotton-growing economy, the South needed more land, and it could conquer that. That was a big part of what Manifest Destiny was about. That's what Texas was about. That's what the war with Mexico was about. And that's what the efforts to take over Central America and Cuba were about. But once it got the land, once it conquered the land, it needed more slaves to work the land, because the land really wasn't worth that much unless you could open it up, unless you could plant the cotton, unless you could grow it, and then the cotton would eat it up and you'd move on. The great thing about slaves is that they were portable. As you expanded west, you could just keep taking your labor force with you. They didn't have to think about it. In fact, they didn't get a chance to think about it. So all of this played into Bunch's dispatches. And so convincing was he that with his arguments that the southern states would have no choice but to reopen the transatlantic slave trade, that even when the Confederate Constitution banned it officially in 1861, the British envoy to Washington wrote back to the Foreign Office saying, don't pay any attention to that. That's just something they're saying for now, and they'll change course immediately as soon as they win their independence, if that happens. Every time that the Crown came close to backing the Confederacy, and there were those times, certainly in 1861 and 1862, the question of the slave trade came up, and every time the South gave the wrong answer to the British cabinet. So what was it that drove Bunch to do all this? Ultimately, although he was no master spy, I have to say in some key respects he was a little like John le Carré's George Smiley. He was a professional representing the interests of his government as best he could, a pro whose job involved, and I love this phrase from le Carré, excursions into the mystery of human behavior disciplined by the practical application of his own deductions, which I think some of my colleagues from the Washington Post will find a familiar approach to the job. Thanks to our man in Charleston, the United States remained united, even if, in the minds of some, the war between the states goes on. Thank you. So now questions and answers. And, oh, come on, please. Yes.
Actually, I have two questions for you. The first one's just a simple fact. I grew up in Charleston, and I was curious if you knew where he was living when he was in Charleston.
Yeah, he started out on Trad. 58 Trad. Yeah, but okay. 58 Trad Street then is not 58 Trad Street now.
Right.
But it's just a couple of doors away.
Okay.
And then he moved to Meeting Street. And he was really just about 2 blocks from the Battery.
Largely south of Broad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But my real question is, in South Carolina, in the Revolutionary War, we basically had a civil war. It was very ugly. Mm-hmm. A lot of very hard feelings. The Royalists lost, mm-hmm. and a lot of the independence supporters were down in Charleston. Mm-hmm. So I can see why there are economic reasons to potentially cooperate on both sides come the Civil War. But did those old hard feelings still influence some of this politic between the Confederacy and Britain?
Well, actually, it was kind of confused in Charleston as a result of those emotions. Some of Bunch's correspondence, in fact, that he's sending back is saying, okay, they're courting me. They've made me the head of the St. George Society. They're doing all this. And in fact, there was this whole thing going on in 1860-61 where the secessionists were saying to the British, we really would like to be part of the empire again. Maybe we could answer to the Queen again. Maybe this is really our destiny because after all, we're aristocrats and it all sort of fits with what we want to do. And at the same time, he would note that they were celebrating Evacuation Day, which was the day that the British pulled out of Charleston. So there were very mixed messages, often not only in the same community, but from the same people.
You mentioned that he sent so many dispatches and reports to London, etc., sometimes through Washington, and apparently otherwise through British ships. Apparently he used some kind of code, because I find it very odd that more of these messages were not intercepted and read by the South.
Well, some of them were. Some of them were, but not the ones that actually would have revealed what he was doing. In fact, he was at the center of a huge diplomatic incident in 1861 because Seward had spies everywhere and was doing his damnedest to intercept all the correspondence he could, but we think, was not opening diplomatic bags. But what had happened was Bunch, in order to get his correspondence out after the war had begun, often had to employ couriers who were pretty kind of hit and miss. A lot of them were naturalized Americans who had originally come from Britain, and one of them got caught by actually two of them got caught by Seward's people, and one of them had a note saying that Bunch had been involved with an effort to talk to the Confederate government about observing British neutrality. Seward threw a fit, demanded that Bunch be removed from his office, and the British refused to do it because they knew what Bunch had been reporting and where his actual analysis was and where his loyalties were, and they refused to take him out, but they wouldn't tell Seward that. So because of this confusion, though, it created an enormous amount of attention that then set the stage for what's called the Trent Affair, where the British and the Americans almost went to war. All that happened within a space of about 3 months in late 1861.
So he didn't use a code.
He did use code, and I hope that you are a cryptographer, because a lot of the letters, not a lot, but quite a few of the letters that I got were in code, and I fear that it was a one-time pad. In fact, there's uncoded correspondence where he keeps telling Lord Lyons, for instance, who was the British minister to Washington, I think I'm going to master this code thing. I'm doing my best on it, but it's so time-consuming, and he would break out of code frequently. So there are some letters that are a little bit in code and a little bit handwritten, and then there's a couple in the collection of his correspondence that, if it's not a one-time pad, might allow a cryptographer to decode them because they've been decoded. The code is all like this, and then they've been decoded, written across it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for this. And I come at all of this from a different perspective as a descendant of people who were enslaved. And so I certainly take the whole issue of slavery, its causes, its ramifications, the way in which we see it still reflected, and certainly in Charleston very seriously. I'm sure you probably are aware that Mother Emanuel was Denmark Vesey's church. He was a founder of that church, and I'm glad that you mentioned him several times in your book. I'm curious as to when you were last in Charleston, how much time you spent there, and what your thoughts are about contemporary Charleston. And if you've seen the Denmark Vesey statue, that is now in Hampton Park.
Yeah.
It's a magnificent statue.
Yeah. The last time I was in Charleston was a few months ago. It was before the incidents at Emmanuel AME. I haven't been back there since. I'm looking forward to going there in a couple of weeks, as a matter of fact, not only to talk about my book, but also to get a better sense on the ground of the way things are. I have a lot of friends in Charleston who've been writing to me and talking to me about the situation down there. And I think that And of course, my father lived in South Carolina, in Columbia, not Charleston, for about 25
state
years.
capital.
And I was horrified, obviously, by what happened, but gratified by the reaction to it, finally, by the powers that be in the state government. If Nikki Haley comes out and says, we got to take that flag down, that's good. If you've got a Republican state senator,
and Strom Thurmond's son, Senator Thurmond.
Yeah, and there's a lot, saying it's time for it to come down. And I think that's good, and the debate is good. It's good for people to remember that that flag, that the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia was the flag that was flown by Robert E. Lee, and he rolled it up when he surrendered, and he put it away. It wasn't flying over Washington and Lee or Washington College when he was the president there. And it started flying again as a response to the civil rights movement in the 1950s. And that's what that flag represents. But I mean, when I was going to school in Atlanta, most of the state flag of Georgia was the battle flag of Northern Virginia. And of course, it was flying over the state capitol the whole time my father was teaching at the University of South Carolina. So I'm glad that people are finally looking at that issue more or less in the face, although there have been 100+ pro-Confederate flag rallies, I don't know how big, scattered around the South.
And there will continue to be. But I don't want any of us to forget or underestimate the power of the families of Emanuel 9.
No, I don't think so. I don't think we will.
Unbelievable, acts of forgiveness.
Christianity.
And Christianity.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, y'all are going to have to fight it out there.
I'll be quick. I've been noting that the Texas State Board covering textbooks and the approval of them has been recently considering history books and its treatment of slavery. I'm curious whether you have had any opportunity to talk about your book in Texas. Or
Not yet.
In communications with those people and what you might recommend to those trying to get a broader view of history than it seems to be reflected.
Well, I would recommend that every grade buy this book. But I don't think that's going to happen in Texas. I mean, Texas is still one of those places where politicians stand up and talk about secession. I mean, what are they thinking? Well, are they thinking?
Two questions. The first and the smallest is, when this is made into a movie, who would you like to play Bunch?
I don't know. I mean,
You've given it thought.
I haven't given it really any thought. No.
Give it thought. Okay. Second question is, when you decided this was a person of interest, where did you start your research and what primary resources did you discover?
It started. I focused on Bunch when I was doing this research about Richard Francis Burton, and I was going through the consular dispatches at the British National Archives at Kew, which is a great place to work. If any of you are researchers and you haven't been to Kew, you should go. It's terribly well organized. And for this work anyway, looking at 19th century diplomatic correspondence, they were bringing out the original correspondence. So they bring it out, and you can photograph it. You can take a digital camera and you can photograph all of it. So that's what I did. I would go to Kew, get what I wanted, get it. They'd bring it up, and I would photograph hundreds of pages, sometimes more than 1,000 pages in a day, and then I could look at everything on my computer when I was working on the book. But that that consular correspondence, a lot of it has been looked at, has been looked at for about maybe half a dozen books and papers over the years. What hadn't been looked at is Bunch's correspondence dating back to 1853 with the various ministers and chargés d'affaires here in Washington. And that was scattered all over the place. There was, at Oxford, at the Bodleian Library, you can find his correspondence with John Crampton, who was the chargé and then the minister here in D.C. up until, I think, 1856. And then his correspondence with other ministers was at the Norfolk Records Office in Norfolk, England. And then, as it happened, the biggest trove, and I would absolutely recommend that if you can get them to let you in, that you go there. It's the most unusual research experience I've ever had. The biggest trove is at Arundel Castle in West Sussex, which is the Duke of Norfolk's estate, was and still is. It is an enormous castle. If you ever saw the movie Young Victoria, it doubled as Windsor Palace in Young Victoria. And the archives are kept in the archive tower. And you go in through security and you go up the archive tower, and they have a table covered with green cloth, and you sit there and you look through his correspondence with Lord Lyons, who was the British minister to Washington during the war, and Lyons' letter books, all of that. And it's just fantastic stuff. But it's also kind of a funny, funky place to be, because you're up there with all these boxes of letters and people, and you're looking through leaded glass out over the West Sussex countryside, and there are these sort of leaning against the wall are the Young Victoria posters that they've gotten. So it's just a great place. And that was really the mother lode in terms of really refining the picture of Bunch.
So it was primarily through the diplomatic dispatches as opposed to...
Well, his personal dispatches,
diaries,
his personal correspondence
Yeah.
with the British ministers was just, he's very witty and very acerbic, and doesn't hold anything back in the personal correspondence. And he just says sometimes outrageous things, but usually true.
Great, thank you.
Sure. But
A one-time pad is where both parties use the same common, like the Bible or a telephone book, and
yeah, or in this case, I think it would be random symbols. In this case, it would be random symbols. The code was a lot of the code was in Greek letters, but not all of it. So a one-time pad is actually a pad that is given out to two parties or multiple parties, and then there is a way of figuring out the correspondence of the letters. But if it's a one-time pad, it's almost impossible to decrypt, I'm told.
So it was originally created as an original for both parties.
Yeah,
So
but
it
there is
wasn't
this
a common
correspondence.
document.
There is this correspondence where, especially they started using encryption in the correspondence that I read in 1859, around the time of the John Brown affair, where it looked like everything was going to go to hell in a handbasket. And the ones that are decrypted are talking about troop deployments in South Carolina as a result of suspected slave uprisings in the interior, things like that. But you sort of have to guess what these things are, or when it's not encrypted, when it's not decrypted.
Local note, you mentioned the Trent affair. One of the people who was arrested in that on the high seas, I believe, was William Wilson Corcoran's son-in-law,
Oh.
a former congressman from Louisiana who was serving as the secretary to the two
To
diplomats.
Slidell and Mason?
Yeah. The reason, or where I'm going, and I hope you can respond to, is Corcoran, who founded the Corcoran Gallery here, and has been also founded Oak Hill Cemetery, and the National Arboretum and a few other things. Made his money selling U.S. government bonds in Britain to finance the Mexican War in the 1850s. Did you
40s, yeah.
did you come across him in your
I
research?
didn't really know. I mean, there are references to him in the accounts of the Trent Affair and the whole arrest of Slidell and Mason, but I didn't get into I didn't get into any details about his activities or what he was doing. But he sounds like another guy for me to follow up. Is there a Wikipedia entry about him?
There is some Wikipedia on him, and he was an interesting and very benevolent guy in lots of ways. I mean, he supported churches and founded a home near the Louise home, which is now the Louise Hunt something. Hmm? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. He was a good guy, except he believed strenuously in states' rights, and he backed the South.
And so he believed in slavery and might have owned a few.
I believe he had freed his own slaves in Washington, in D.C., in the 1840s.
Well, we'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
On Wikipedia, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think you said Bunch left Charleston in 1863.
Right.
Why did he leave, and how did he get out?
He left on a British warship because the British were able to move their warships in and out of Charleston through most of the conflict, and certainly up through early 1863. He left because it looked like the siege of Charleston was about to begin in earnest in early 1863. In fact, Charleston never fell, but at the time, the thinking was it was time for him to go. He had actually lost his exequatur, which is the accreditation given by the federal government at the end of 1861, but the British just wouldn't remove him. They were afraid, however, that in 1863, if the federal forces moved in, he would be in an ambiguous and dangerous position, and so they took him out.
Thank you.
Did the British government have any other diplomatic representatives in the South in the Civil War?
Yeah.
And if so, what was their roles and what were their relationships with your subject?
Well, the British had 14 consuls in the United States in 1860, but only 2 of them were paid professionals. The rest were more or less what you would call today honorary consuls, although they did report to the Crown, they did report an official correspondence. For instance, Molyneux in Savannah was a big slave owner and was a very, very rich man, had married an heiress, and was a very unreliable reporter. Others were just desperate to get out, the ones who were more or less British citizens from Britain. There was one in Mobile, Alabama, who just seems never to have been in Mobile, Alabama. He just couldn't stand it. But there was another one who I think probably we don't know enough about how he was paid, but William Muir in New Orleans was quite good. He was a little bit more sympathetic to the South in his official correspondence than Bunch was, but his correspondence by and large was pretty straight. There was one in Richmond who was also okay, but he was more almost an honorary consul. Earlier there had been a best-selling novelist, a British novelist, had been the consul in Richmond. But Bunch was a professional, and the other professional was Archibald, who was the consul in New York City. And Archibald was running a whole spy network in Cuba at the same time, because one of the things that I discovered, well, I should have said this earlier, one of the things I discovered when I was at Kew at the National Archives is that there are 2 sets of diplomatic dispatches from all these consuls. One is the set having to do with more or less conventional political and especially economic issues, tariffs, customs barriers, things like that, and the particular issues on the ground in the various ports they were in. The other set of correspondence is the slave trade correspondence, because the British were obsessed with the question of the slave trade. In fact, in the 1850s, the single biggest division of the Foreign Office was the Slave Trade Office. They were tracking the slave trade everywhere on the globe. And Bunch's reporting is almost evenly divided between his slave trade correspondence and the conventional consular correspondence, as well as what ultimately was a lot of political reporting.
Thank you. But
Sure.
In the slave trade correspondence you referred to, what would they talk about?
Well, one of the things you have to know that I think most people don't know is that the slave trade was outlawed by Great Britain and the United States in 1807. Great Britain emancipated its own slaves in the Caribbean and elsewhere in 1833. South obviously did not, the southern United States. But the slave trade went on to Brazil until 1850 and to Cuba until after the American Civil War. And the slave trade to Cuba was huge because the slave trade to Cuba was a little bit different than the slave trade to the United States. Growing cotton was one thing. Growing sugar is something else. Sugar is a deadly crop for the people who work in the cane breaks. And what the Cuban economy depended on was the importation of Africans who could be bought for $50 or $100 apiece, who could be worked to death and then replaced with cheap African labor again. And now that is horrible. But what's really horrible is that almost all of that trade in the 1850s was taking place under the Stars and Stripes, the American flag. And the reason for that was that the going back to the War of 1812 and before, the Americans said the British could not search American flag vessels. And the Americans refused to sign any treaty of mutual search for suspect slavers. So what happened was the slavers would go out and they would pick up their cargoes, and if they saw a British vessel approaching, they would run up the Stars and Stripes and refuse to be searched. And there was even, because the Americans theoretically were on the same side as the British in this issue, there was an American squadron as well off the coast of Africa. But it spent most of its time not capturing slavers, but interfering with the British efforts to capture them. You also have to remember, and this is something people forget, the federal government was controlled by the South until the 1850s. That was what the South didn't want to lose. That's why there was so much anger and paranoia and fear in the South in the 1850s, is because they saw they were going to lose control of the Senate. So one of the things that they wanted to do was take over Cuba, because Cuba would have given them 2 more states, 4 more senators to back the slaveholding cause. All of that is almost lost in American history. People don't know this stuff. It's not a secret. It's just people don't know it. If you know it, it starts to tell you a hell of a lot of things. It tells you why the Cubans feel the way they do about a lot of issues. It tells you how corrupt the North was as well as the South, and how much it was implicated in the horrors of the slave trade. You know, when people talk, if you go look on, I'm sure they've got books on the slave trade here, they're almost all going to be about slave trade in the 18th century and early 19th century. But the slave trade in the middle of the 19th century was every bit as horrible as the slave trade had been at any point. They would take on, and there were examples of people starting to reopen the slave trade with Africa. The Wanderer, the Clotilda, other boats that the British were reporting on would pick up 400, 500, 600 slaves and lose 150, 200, 250. Just throw them overboard when they got sick or died. And a lot of them did, because they were crammed in, as one American naval officer who was involved in the short-lived effort to stop the slave trade to Cuba said when he visited one of the ships after it's been stopped, he said there wasn't enough space to die in below decks. And this is what the secessionists wanted to reopen. This is what they were arguing was good. And that's why there's a chapter in the book where a ship called the Echo, or also called the Putnam, was brought into Charleston Harbor. And it stank. One of the characteristics of slave trade ships was that they were putrid. And people could smell it. They took but they didn't see the people unless they went out to what was the still unfinished Fort Sumter in 1858, where they took the slaves off that ship and they put them in Fort Sumter. And you read the Charleston Mercury, which was a big pro-slavery, pro-secession organ, and the Mercury says they were happy, well-fed, dancing. You read the dispatches of the man who took care of them, the sheriff who took care of them, who was a pro-secession, pro-slave trade guy, and he describes the people so weak that they couldn't get over a lintel this high to get into the fort. They would have to sit down and swing their legs over, and dying one after another, after another, after another. And even when they were put on the biggest American warship of that time, the Niagara, and taken back to Africa, in fact to Liberia, a place they'd never been before, they continued to die at the rate of several a day. So when anybody tells you that it's not about slavery, oh hell yeah, it was all about slavery. So
that was a great note to end on. But
I thought so.
Yeah. But figures like Bunch, who become kind of unexpected heroes because they seize the moment somehow, are really fascinating. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about why Bunch did this, but also what causes somebody to act that way at their moment.
Well, one of the fun things, if that's the word, about writing a book like this, actually writing any book, fiction or nonfiction, it's always a process of discovery. But when things come together in nonfiction, it's telling you stuff that you would never have known or wouldn't have been smart enough to write in fiction. And the thing about Bunch is that he's not a heroic character. What he did was heroic, but he's not heroic. He's going down to South Carolina in 1853. He's going there because he thinks it's going to advance his career, because he's a consul and he's tired of writing about ships coming in and out of ports, and he wants a political question. And there was a political question then, which was what was called the Negro Seaman Act, which came after Denmark Vesey, who in 1822 was accused of plotting a rebellion, and horrific stories came out from the torture of Vesey and other people, and it's still, people are trying to parse the truth from the fiction in that, but it was just a horror story that lingered with everybody. And Vesey had come from the Caribbean, been brought by his master from the Caribbean, and he had actually won the lottery and bought his freedom before he became a preacher and this very prominent figure in the black community in Charleston. And so the lesson for white Charlestonians was, we don't want any free people coming from the Caribbean. And so what they would do is, if a British boat landed with even a black stevedore on it, he had to be thrown in jail and held there until the ship left. And if a bond was not paid, he would just sort of disappear into the world of the slave trade, the domestic slave trade in South Carolina. So that was the issue that Bunch seized on, and he thought he could really make some political headway. And he negotiated with the governors, and he did all that, and eventually he got that law modified in a way that was acceptable. But he was a careerist. That was what he started out to do. But from his earliest days, actually there, with his wife and then with his child, you see in his correspondence this absolute revulsion, not just at the institution of the slavery, but at the way the people around him talked about it, the way they talked about beating their slaves. There's one incredible revealing dispatch from he'd been there like 2 months, and he talked about a conversation with a lawyer who lived next door to him, who said that he personally beat his own slaves, both the men and the women, after making them undress and telling them that they were lucky to be touched by him. Gives you a feel for the atmosphere. So Bunch basically said, I just can't accept this. But he was a member of the jockey club. He would go to all the dinners. Everybody thought he was their best friend. And in fact, the Charleston Mercury, when he sailed out on the Cadmus, the warship, in 1863, said he must be being removed because he was too sympathetic to the South.
Wasn't there a mutiny of slaves aboard a ship? And
Well, the Amistad is famous.
yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that was much earlier. That was much earlier.
Yes, a long time
Yeah.
before that. Yeah. Remind us what occurred then.
Well, there was a really good movie about it, but it was what happened on the Amistad was, I'm trying to remember exactly, because it was about 20 years. It was the 1840s, I think,
Yes.
the Amistad. And it didn't involve my people directly, so I didn't follow it as closely as others. But one of the great stories of a mutiny was that I can tell you about, was that this same ship, the Echo, eventually was taken by the Confederates when the war began, and it became a privateer, and it seized a ship down in off the coast of South America that had several black crew members, including a cook who was black, and that ship was being taken back to Charleston as a prize of war by the privateer, and the cook killed the prize crew and sailed it to New York instead.
Oh, done.
And he became a great hero, and in fact was on display at P.T. Barnum's circus as a great hero. You can read there. Actually, there's a great account of this in Harper's Weekly back in 1861. So there were mutinies, and there were slave mutinies, and these issues happened. But the specifics of the Amistad, I'm not the person to tell you about that.
Thank you.
Are we done, or is it?
So we have time for one more question.
Thank you. This work anyway. I was involved a lot in the civil rights in the 1960s. And
Well, I thought you were going to say the Civil War.
yeah. Well, thanks.
I work with a lot of young people. They ask me all the time.
I'm glad I'm holding my own.
Yeah.
But what happened in Charleston really it really took me back 50 years, because the way people were behaving, that strength of character and that grace of soul, really that was exactly what made the civil rights movement so incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
But when you were talking about Charleston, how much of a movement was there? I should know this. After the Mexican War, how much of a movement was there to take over parts of Mexico? I remember we didn't do it.
Well, we did a lot of it.
Well, no, we took all the empty land. No, we took all the empty land.
Yeah.
We took all the empty land, but we did not. But there was a lot of back and forth about whether they should take the whole country, and I was wondering about.
There's a big drive
the
to do
slave
that.
trade. Did Mexico have slaves?
No.
That's the thing. So it wouldn't have figured in the way Cuba did.
Well, not the way Cuba did at that point, but the idea of a lot of the Southerners was to expand into Mexico and take slaves there. That's why you needed to bring them from Africa.
It did figure. Okay, I was wondering where how that worked.
And it was there was also an effort, the famous William Walker expedition to Nicaragua, the filibusters, the filibusteros.
Yeah.
So all of that was going on. In fact, I was talking to a French scholar the other day who was interested in a lot of the same issues. There's like 3 of us who are in the world. And it was interesting that the Emperor of France, when he took over Mexico and installed Maximilian, he was actually convinced by Slidell, one of the guys on the Trent, who eventually wound up in Paris, that the South would act as a buffer state between imperial Mexico and the Union government in the North, when in fact the reporting from the French consuls and from the British consuls was saying, hell no, that's not true. They want Mexico for themselves.
Right. Yeah.
Because you have to remember that cotton burned out the land, so you just moved
Used
on.
it up, yeah. I don't want to take up other people's time, but I lived in, I'm from here, but I lived in Austin quite a while. And one of the things that people may or may not be aware of is that part of the reason the Americans were able to take over Texas is because the Indians, essentially, the Comanche and the Catawba, kind of stopped the Mexicans, stopped the Spanish. It was a line from Corpus Christi to San Antonio to El Paso, and when they went north there, they wiped them out. And in fact, they joked that we would have driven the white men further south, but we need to keep them close enough to steal their horses. This is the Comanche and the Kiowa, but there were only 3,000 or 4,000 Mexican civilians in all of Texas.
That was before the Texans wiped out the
only
Comanches.
Only a few thousand in California.
Yeah.
And part of the reason the Americans took over is because they came pouring in. They were like the English in Australia and America, showing up with the wives and the kids and the slaves and the cattle. And I mean, Americans came pouring in. There were 50,000 to 60,000 Americans and 4,000 or 5,000 Mexicans when the Mexican War, when the Texas Revolution broke out. But
the ambition was to take all of Mexico if you could.
Okay.
Because the other thing that was going on, not to go on and on about this, I'm sure people are getting hungry, but the other thing that was going on is the gold rush that began in 1849 meant that suddenly there was this huge imperative to get to California. And precisely because of the Comanche and so on, it was hard to go across, and the Sioux, it was hard to go across the continental United States. So everybody was looking for a quick way through the isthmus. And one way was through the isthmus of Tehuantepec. Another way was through Nicaragua. Another way was through the jungles of Panama. And these were all competing to some extent. So that had hugely increased the interest and the value of Central America and southern Mexico as well as northern Mexico. So there you go. Sure.